The morning sun cast long shadows across Naval Base Coronado as Marcus Thompson stepped out of his pickup truck, his civilian clothes marking him as an outsider among the sea of military uniforms. At 23, Marcus carried himself with the swagger of someone who had never been told no, his father's construction company fortune providing him with every comfort life could offer. Today, he was visiting his childhood friend, Jake Martinez, who had recently graduated from the grueling Navy SEAL training program. Marcus had grown up hearing stories about the elite warriors, but he had always dismissed them as overhyped marketing. In his mind, these so-called special forces were just regular guys who happened to wear fancy uniforms and get more attention than they deserved. His own success in business, inherited though it was, had convinced him that he was naturally superior to most people he encountered. The base was bustling with activity as Marcus made his way toward the training compound. Groups of sailors jogged past in perfect formation, their synchronized footsteps echoing off the concrete pathways. He rolled his eyes at what he saw as unnecessary showmanship, checking his expensive watch impatiently as he waited for Jake to meet him at the visitor's entrance. Jake appeared after a few minutes, looking leaner and more focused than Marcus remembered. His friend's transformation was obvious. The soft edges of civilian life had been carved away, replaced by sharp angles and an alert gaze that seemed to take in everything at once. They embraced briefly, and Marcus immediately noticed the difference in Jake's grip, the controlled strength that hadn't been there before. As they walked through the compound, Jake explained some of the training routines and facilities, his voice carrying a quiet pride that Marcus found irritating. Every building, every piece of equipment, every mention of their instructors seemed to fill Jake with reverence that Marcus couldn't understand. To him, it all looked like an expensive playground for grown men who couldn't find real jobs. They stopped outside the physical training area, where several groups were engaged in various exercises. Marcus watched as men performed impossible-looking feats of endurance and strength, their bodies moving with precision that spoke of countless hours of practice. Jake pointed out different teams and explained their specializations, but Marcus was only half listening, more interested in proving his own theories about military superiority being nothing but myth. Near the obstacle course, a solitary figure was completing what appeared to be a punishment workout. The man moved through burpees, mountain climbers, and weighted carries with mechanical efficiency, sweat pouring down his face but his expression remaining unchanged. Jake mentioned quietly that this was Petty Officer First Class Ryan Mitchell, one of their most respected instructors, working through his own fitness routine during a break between classes. Marcus studied Mitchell with growing confidence. The SEAL was average height, maybe 5'10", with a build that was solid but not imposing. He looked like any number of construction workers Marcus had supervised over the years. There were no obvious signs of the superhuman capabilities that military propaganda liked to promote. In fact, Mitchell appeared almost ordinary as he moved through his exercises, focused entirely on his workout and oblivious to the watching civilians. The more Marcus observed, the more convinced he became that his initial assessment had been correct. These Navy SEALs were ordinary men who had been given extraordinary reputations through clever marketing and media manipulation. The mystique surrounding them was nothing more than smoke and mirrors designed to intimidate enemies and impress civilians who didn't know better. Jake continued his guided tour, sharing stories of his training experiences with enthusiasm that grated on Marcus's nerves. Every anecdote seemed designed to elevate these military men to mythical status. And Marcus found himself growing increasingly annoyed by what he perceived as his friend's brainwashing. The old Jake had been reasonable and grounded. This new version seemed to have drunk the military Kool-Aid completely. As they approached the end of their visit, Marcus's frustration reached a boiling point. He had come here expecting to be impressed, but instead found himself more convinced than ever that the entire Navy SEAL program was built on hype rather than substance. The men he had observed looked tough enough, certainly, but no tougher than the workers he managed every day in the construction business. Standing near the training area's exit, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He had spent his entire life being told he couldn't compete with these so-called elite warriors, but nothing he had seen today supported that claim. If anything, he was more confident than ever that the Emperor had no clothes, and it was time someone called out the charade for what it really was. Marcus turned to Jake with a smirk that his friend recognized from their teenage years, the same expression that had preceded every bad decision they had ever made together. Jake immediately felt a knot forming in his stomach as he watched Marcus's gaze shift back to Petty Officer Mitchell, who was now cleaning up his equipment with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. Without warning, Marcus stepped away from Jake and called out across the training area in a voice loud enough to carry over the ambient noise of the base. His words cut through the air like a challenge thrown into an arena, and Jake felt his blood run cold as he realized what was about to happen. Marcus approached Mitchell with the confident stride of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. He had spent years intimidating employees and competitors through sheer force of personality and financial pressure, and he saw no reason why this situation should be any different. The fact that he was on a military base, surrounded by some of the most dangerous men in the world, didn't register as relevant information in his mind. Mitchell looked up from his equipment, his expression neutral but alert. Years of training had taught him to assess threats instantly, and while the approaching civilian didn't appear physically dangerous, there was something in his demeanor that triggered Mitchell's professional instincts. He straightened slowly, his hands remaining relaxed at his sides but ready to move if necessary. The SEAL's calm reaction only fueled Marcus's confidence further. He had expected some kind of aggressive posturing, the sort of chest-thumping display that civilians associated with military machismo. Instead, Mitchell just stood there waiting, which Marcus interpreted as a sign of uncertainty or even fear. It was exactly the opening he had been hoping for. Jake hurried after his friend, trying to catch up before the situation escalated beyond repair. He had seen Mitchell in action during training exercises and knew exactly how dangerous the man could be when necessary. The casual way Mitchell carried himself was deceptive. He moved like someone who had never met a physical challenge he couldn't overcome, and his reputation among the other SEALs was built on accomplishments that Jake couldn't even imagine attempting. By the time Jake reached them, Marcus was already deep into his confrontation, his voice carrying the entitled tone that had served him well in business but was completely inappropriate for the current situation. Other personnel in the area had begun to take notice, training sessions gradually slowing as instructors and trainees alike became aware that something unusual was developing near the obstacle course. Mitchell listened to Marcus's challenge with the same patience he might show a confused recruit, his head tilted slightly as if he was trying to understand the logic behind the civilian's words. There was no anger in his expression, no rising tension that might indicate he was taking the bait. If anything, he seemed curious about what would motivate someone to seek out a confrontation under these circumstances. The gathering crowd made Jake even more nervous, as he recognized several faces from his training class. These men had all learned to respect Mitchell through direct experience, having been pushed to their absolute limits under his instruction. They knew exactly what their teacher was capable of, and Jake could see the mixture of disbelief and anticipation in their eyes as they watched the scene unfold. Marcus, meanwhile, was interpreting Mitchell's calm demeanor as validation of his theories about military superiority being nothing but propaganda. The SEAL wasn't rising to the challenge because he knew he was outmatched. Just as Marcus had suspected all along, every moment of silence was proof that years of hype and reputation building were about to crumble under the pressure of real-world testing. What Marcus failed to understand was that Mitchell's composure came from a place of absolute confidence rather than uncertainty. The SEAL had faced enemy fighters, survived countless training scenarios designed to break lesser men, and earned his position through demonstrable competence rather than inherited privilege. He had nothing to prove to a civilian who clearly had no understanding of what real combat training entailed. The tension in the air continued to build as more personnel became aware of the situation. Word was spreading quickly through the compound that a civilian was challenging one of their most respected instructors, and the general consensus was that someone needed to intervene before things went too far. But Mitchell himself seemed content to let the situation develop naturally, perhaps curious to see how far the young man would push his luck. Jake made one last desperate attempt to defuse the situation, grabbing Marcus by the arm and trying to pull him away from what he knew would be a devastating encounter. But Marcus shook off his friend's grip, more determined than ever to prove his point now that he had an audience. The stage was set for a demonstration that would become base legend, though not in the way Marcus expected. The moment arrived with shocking suddenness. Marcus, emboldened by what he mistook for hesitation on Mitchell's part, made his move. Drawing back his right leg with all the confidence of someone who had never faced a trained fighter, he launched a clumsy kick aimed at Mitchell's midsection. It was the kind of wild, untrained attack that might work in a bar fight against an unprepared opponent, but looked almost comical when directed at someone with Mitchell's level of training. Time seemed to slow as Mitchell's body reacted with the automatic responses that had been drilled into him through thousands of hours of combat training. His movement was so fluid and effortless that several witnesses later said it looked almost like a dance, each motion flowing seamlessly into the next without any apparent thought or hesitation. Marcus's kick never came close to connecting. Mitchell stepped aside with minimal movement, letting the amateur attack pass harmlessly through empty air, while simultaneously positioning himself for what would come next. His counter-movement was surgical in its precision, designed not to cause maximum damage but to end the confrontation as quickly and safely as possible. What followed was a brief display of controlled violence that left every observer speechless. Mitchell's response was measured but devastating, using Marcus's own momentum against him in a way that sent the civilian spinning through the air before landing hard on the training mat. The entire sequence lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds contained enough technique and power to make it clear that Mitchell had been holding back considerably. Marcus hit the ground with a sound that echoed across the suddenly silent training area. The impact drove the wind from his lungs and left him gasping like a fish out of water, his expensive clothes now dirty and torn from the encounter. For several long moments, he couldn't even process what had happened, his brain struggling to reconcile his expectations with the reality of lying flat on his back while stars danced behind his eyes. The crowd of military personnel who had gathered to watch remained frozen in stunned silence. Many of them had trained under Mitchell for months and thought they understood his capabilities, but seeing those skills demonstrated against an actual opponent was entirely different from experiencing them during controlled exercises. The casual ease with which he had handled the situation was somehow more impressive than any formal demonstration could have been. Jake stood with his mouth open, torn between embarrassment for his friend and amazement at what he had just witnessed. He had known Mitchell was skilled, but the reality of watching a master practitioner in action was humbling in ways he hadn't expected. Every movement had been purposeful and efficient, with no wasted energy or unnecessary flourish to mar the technical perfection of the response. Mitchell himself seemed almost unaffected by what had just occurred. He checked briefly to ensure that Marcus wasn't seriously injured, then began gathering his equipment as if nothing unusual had happened. His breathing remained steady and controlled, and there was no sign of the adrenaline rush that would have left a normal person shaking after such an encounter. Marcus eventually managed to get enough air back into his lungs to attempt sitting up, though his equilibrium remained seriously compromised. The world kept spinning around him in uncomfortable ways, and he found himself fighting waves of nausea that made it difficult to focus on anything. Pride demanded that he get back to his feet immediately, but his body wasn't cooperating with his mental commands. The realization of what had actually happened began to sink in as Marcus's vision cleared and his breathing returned to normal. He had not only failed to prove his point about military superiority being overrated, but had done so in spectacular fashion in front of dozens of witnesses. The humiliation was almost worse than the physical discomfort, and he could feel his face burning with embarrassment as he became aware of all the eyes watching him. Jake finally broke from his trance and rushed to help his friend to his feet, offering support that Marcus initially tried to refuse before accepting grudgingly. The construction company heir's legs remained unsteady, and he found himself grateful for the assistance even as he hated needing it. His entire worldview had been shattered in the span of a few seconds, leaving him struggling to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Around them, the gathered personnel began to disperse slowly, returning to their training routines with new stories to share and a renewed respect for their instructor. The incident would be discussed for years to come, becoming part of base folklore and serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating people based on appearances or preconceptions. Mitchell finished packing his equipment and started to walk away, then paused and turned back toward Marcus. His expression remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes that suggested the lesson wasn't quite over yet. The real education was about to begin, though Marcus had no way of knowing what form it would take. Mitchell approached Marcus slowly, his demeanor shifting from the alert professionalism he had shown during the confrontation to something that resembled genuine concern. The SEAL crouched down beside the still-shaken civilian, his voice quiet enough that only Marcus and Jake could hear what he was saying. There was no mockery in his tone, no triumph over his easy victory. Just the patient manner of someone who had something important to teach. Marcus expected anger, or perhaps the kind of verbal assault that often followed physical dominance. Instead, Mitchell began speaking about responsibility and consequences in a way that cut deeper than any insult could have. He explained how real combat was different from the movies, how trained professionals carried the weight of their capabilities every moment of every day, and how that weight shaped every decision they made about when and how to use their skills. The lesson continued as Mitchell helped Marcus to his feet, supporting him until his balance fully returned. He spoke about the years of training that went into developing the reflexes Marcus had just experienced. The mental discipline required to control that level of physical capability, and the ethical framework that governed how such skills could be responsibly employed. Every word was delivered without condescension, but with an authority that made it impossible to dismiss. Jake listened in fascination as Mitchell outlined the reality of military training, dispelling myths and misconceptions with the patience of a teacher addressing a genuinely curious student. The SEAL explained how media portrayals often focused on the spectacular aspects of their work while ignoring the careful preparation, constant study, and strict accountability that made such performances possible. Real strength, he suggested, was as much about knowing when not to use your abilities as it was about having them in the first place. As Mitchell spoke, other personnel began to return to their duties, though many continued glancing over at the unusual conversation taking place near the obstacle course. It wasn't often that civilians received such direct instruction from one of their most respected operators, and the educational value of the moment wasn't lost on the younger trainees who were still within earshot. Marcus found himself hanging on every word, his earlier arrogance replaced by a burning curiosity about the world he had so casually dismissed. Mitchell's explanation of combat psychology, team dynamics, and the mental pressures of special operations painted a picture far more complex than anything Marcus had imagined. The SEAL wasn't just physically capable, he was clearly intelligent, thoughtful, and operating from a philosophical framework that Marcus hadn't known existed. The conversation gradually shifted from general principles to specific examples. As Mitchell shared stories from his own training and deployment experiences, he spoke about failures as readily as successes, emphasizing how each mistake had contributed to his development and understanding. The picture that emerged was of a profession that demanded constant learning, adaptation, and self-reflection, rather than the mindless aggression Marcus had expected. Mitchell also addressed the civilian misconceptions that had led to their encounter, explaining how popular culture often portrayed military personnel as either superhuman warriors or damaged individuals who solved every problem through violence. The reality, he suggested, was far more nuanced, involving ordinary people who had chosen to develop extraordinary capabilities through sustained effort and sacrifice. As the impromptu lesson continued, Marcus began to understand the depth of his earlier ignorance. He had approached the situation with assumptions based on movies, television shows, and second-hand stories rather than any actual knowledge of military training or culture. His confidence had been built on a foundation of complete misunderstanding, and the collapse of that foundation was proving more educational than any formal classroom experience. Jake watched his friend's transformation with amazement, recognizing the same intellectual hunger that had driven Marcus's business success, but now directed toward understanding something genuinely challenging rather than simply exploiting inherited advantages. For the first time in years, Marcus seemed to be encountering something that he couldn't buy, manipulate, or dismiss, and the experience was clearly affecting him profoundly. Mitchell concluded his impromptu lecture by extending an invitation that surprised everyone within hearing range. He suggested that Marcus might benefit from observing some actual training sessions, not as a participant but as an educated observer who could begin to understand the complexity and dedication involved in military preparation. The offer came with conditions and limitations, but it represented an opportunity that few civilians ever received. The gesture demonstrated the same controlled generosity that had characterized Mitchell's physical response to the original attack. Rather than simply humiliating Marcus and sending him away, the SEAL was offering him a chance to transform his ignorance into understanding through direct observation and continued conversation. It was an investment in education rather than punishment, and it would prove to change both men in ways neither could have predicted. Over the following weeks, Marcus returned to the naval base with a regularity that surprised both Jake and himself. What had begun as a humiliating encounter had evolved into the most meaningful education of his life. Mitchell, true to his word, arranged for Marcus to observe various training exercises from safe distances, always accompanied by detailed explanations of what was happening and why. The first session Marcus witnessed was a team coordination drill that looked deceptively simple from the outside. Groups of trainees moved through an obstacle course while communicating constantly, each member supporting the others in ways that weren't immediately obvious to civilian observers. Mitchell explained how every movement was choreographed, not through rigid rehearsal, but through shared understanding of principles and objectives that allowed for improvisation within structure. Marcus began to recognize the intellectual complexity underlying what he had previously dismissed as simple physical activity, the mental calculations required for effective teamwork under pressure, the constant assessment of changing conditions, and the split-second decision-making that could mean the difference between success and failure demanded cognitive abilities that rivaled any business challenge he had encountered. During a marksmanship session, Marcus observed the meditation-like focus that preceded each shot, the controlled breathing and mental preparation that transformed the act of firing a weapon into something resembling a spiritual practice. Mitchell explained how accuracy under stress required not just physical skill, but emotional regulation and mental clarity that took years to develop and maintain. The psychological aspects of the training proved particularly fascinating to Marcus. He learned about stress inoculation, the deliberate exposure to controlled adversity that built resilience for real-world applications. The concept challenged everything he thought he knew about comfort and performance, suggesting that his privileged upbringing might actually have been a disadvantage in developing certain kinds of strength. Mitchell also introduced Marcus to the concept of tactical thinking, the ability to simultaneously manage multiple variables while maintaining awareness of the larger strategic picture. During planning exercises, Marcus watched trainees work through scenarios that required them to balance competing priorities, assess risks, and develop contingency plans for situations that could change without warning. The more Marcus learned, the more he realized how much he didn't know. His business experience had given him confidence in certain types of problem solving, but the military environment demanded skills and perspectives that were entirely foreign to him. The humility was initially uncomfortable, but gradually became energizing as he recognized opportunities for personal growth that he had never imagined. Most surprising to Marcus was the discovery that many of the principles underlying military excellence could be applied to civilian challenges. The emphasis on continuous improvement, systematic preparation, and team-oriented thinking offered insights that could revolutionize his approach to business and personal relationships. Mitchell's teachings extended far beyond combat applications to encompass leadership, communication, and ethical decision-making. As their relationship developed, Marcus found himself seeking Mitchell's advice on non-military matters, curious about how special operations principles might apply to construction management, employee relations, and strategic planning. The SEAL's responses revealed a breadth of knowledge and perspective that challenged Marcus's assumptions about military personnel being narrowly focused on warfare. Jake watched his friend's transformation with amazement and approval. The arrogant young man who had strutted onto the base weeks earlier was being replaced by someone genuinely committed to learning and growth. Marcus's questions became more sophisticated, his observations more insightful, and his respect for the people around him more evident with each visit. The relationship was proving beneficial for Mitchell as well. Teaching someone completely outside the military culture forced him to articulate concepts and principles that he normally took for granted, deepening his own understanding of why certain approaches were effective. Marcus's business background also provided interesting perspectives on organizational management and resource allocation that enriched Mitchell's own thinking. Word of the unusual mentorship spread throughout the base, creating a ripple effect that influenced other personnel's attitudes toward civilian-military relations. The sight of a former antagonist genuinely working to understand their world provided a positive example of how initial conflicts could be transformed into mutual learning opportunities through patience, respect, and open communication. As Marcus's education continued, he began to formulate plans for applying his new knowledge to his civilian life. The construction company he would eventually inherit could benefit from military-inspired approaches to safety, team building, and project management. More importantly, he was developing personal qualities of discipline, humility, and purposefulness that would serve him well, regardless of his professional circumstances. 6 months after the incident that had changed everything, Marcus stood before a gathering of naval personnel at the base's main auditorium. He had been invited to speak about his experience as part of a community outreach program, sharing his perspective on civilian-military understanding, with an audience that included many who had witnessed his initial confrontation with Mitchell. The transformation was remarkable to everyone who had known Marcus before. Where once he had carried himself with the entitled swagger of inherited privilege, he now moved with the measured confidence of someone who had learned to respect both his own capabilities and their limitations. His speech reflected the same evolution, as he spoke honestly about his previous ignorance and the educational journey that had followed. Marcus began by acknowledging the assumptions and prejudices that had led to his embarrassing encounter with Mitchell, taking full responsibility for his behavior while explaining how those attitudes had developed. He spoke about the isolation that wealth and privilege could create, cutting people off from experiences and perspectives that might challenge their worldview in productive ways. The audience listened with interest, as Marcus detailed specific lessons he had learned about leadership, teamwork, and personal discipline. He shared examples of how military principles had transformed his approach to business challenges, employee relations, and personal goal setting. The practical applications made his testimony relevant even to personnel who might otherwise dismiss civilian perspectives as irrelevant to their own experiences. Most importantly, Marcus emphasized the mutual learning opportunities that existed when people from different backgrounds approached each other with genuine curiosity rather than predetermined judgments. His relationship with Mitchell had evolved into a genuine friendship that enriched both their lives, demonstrating how initial conflicts could become foundations for meaningful connection and growth. The speech concluded with Marcus announcing a scholarship program he was establishing to provide educational opportunities for military personnel transitioning to civilian careers. The initiative would be funded through his construction company and administered in partnership with local educational institutions, creating pathways for veterans to develop skills relevant to civilian employment, while contributing their military experience to business environments. After the formal presentation, Marcus fielded questions from the audience that revealed both the depth of his learning and the ongoing nature of his education. His answers demonstrated genuine understanding of military culture, while acknowledging areas where he still had much to learn. The humility was refreshing to personnel accustomed to civilian speakers who claimed instant expertise after minimal exposure to their world. Mitchell, watching from the back of the auditorium, felt a satisfaction that went beyond pride in his students' progress. The relationship had reminded him why he had chosen to serve in the first place: the opportunity to make positive differences in people's lives through patient teaching and example. Marcus's transformation validated the investment of time and energy that mentorship required. Jake, seated in the front row, marveled at how completely his friend had changed. The Marcus he had known growing up had been intelligent and capable but limited by his narrow perspective on success and achievement. The person speaking now had developed intellectual curiosity, emotional maturity, and social awareness that made him infinitely more interesting and valuable as a friend and business partner. The Q&A session extended well beyond its scheduled time as personnel engaged Marcus in discussions about specific challenges and opportunities in civilian-military cooperation. His responses demonstrated both practical knowledge and genuine respect for their perspectives, creating the kind of productive dialogue that could benefit both communities in the long term. As the event concluded, many audience members approached Marcus personally to continue conversations begun during the formal session. The networking that followed led to ongoing relationships that would influence both his business development and their transition planning, creating a web of connections that exemplified the mutual benefit possible when different worlds collided constructively. The story became part of base legend, referenced in training sessions about conflict resolution, leadership development, and the importance of maintaining perspective under pressure. Mitchell's handling of the original confrontation was studied as an example of how professionals could respond to provocation in ways that created positive outcomes, rather than simply asserting dominance. Years later, Marcus's construction company became known throughout the region for its veteran-friendly hiring practices and military-inspired management approaches. The business thrived under leadership that combined entrepreneurial innovation with operational excellence, learned from special operations principles, proving that the lessons of that embarrassing day on the naval base had been thoroughly internalized and productively applied. The relationship between Marcus and Mitchell continued to evolve, with each man serving as a bridge between civilian and military communities in ways that benefited both. Their story demonstrated how genuine transformation was possible when people approached conflicts as learning opportunities rather than zero-sum competitions, creating positive change that extended far beyond the individuals directly involved.